Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Humm, and I'm one of the Dialogue Doctor editors, and I'm here with CC Hanson today to work on part of one of her pieces. CC, will you introduce yourself to us, please?
So I'm CC Hanson, and I'm excited to be here. I guess I love writing. I've always loved writing, and sort of a few years ago caught the bug, I guess, and got addicted to it. And I've been working on fiction ever since. So
Excellent. And the piece that we're going to look at today, is this a new work in progress? Is this your first work in progress? Have you published before, or are you working toward a publishing goal?
this is a rewrite of a prequel to a novel that I have written before. So I actually had a prequel written before. I didn't like it. It really wasn't any good. So I decided to just completely overhaul it. And so this is the pre it's a short story prequel to the full novel that I have.
Excellent. And where are you with the novel? Are you still working with it, or have you moved it into the world?
It is in the world right now. So it's
Wonderful.
called Speak Without Words. So
Fantastic. Will you tell us a little about it?
so it's essentially Claire, the protagonist, she moves from sort of rural Wisconsin to the Twin Cities area. And she she and her dad are sort of trying to start fresh after her mom dies. And they encounter some troubles there, and Claire makes some friends on her volleyball team, and each of them kind of have their own struggles. And so it's kind of through Claire working through her friends and seeing her friends struggle, they sort of learn to support each other as friends. And then that kind of helps Claire um, come into her own, I guess. So it's a coming of age young adult story.
That's fantastic. We love coming of age stories, right? We all want to kind of relive our own youth as we go back, and or if we are reading them as teenagers, we like to see that other people have struggles, maybe not the same as ours, but everybody is kind of going through that same struggle to figure out who they are and what they're going to be. So I love that. So thanks for letting us review this with you today. So can you tell us a little bit about where we're picking up in the prequel? You mentioned that Claire's mother dies before she moves to the Twin Cities, and that was an unexpected, traumatic death. So you want to tell us a little bit about that and where the story picks up after?
Yeah, so the prequel is essentially um, Claire lives on a dairy farm, her grandparents' dairy farm, with her parents there too. And her dad wants to move to the Twin Cities, in part because he thinks he can get a better job there, and in part because he thinks Claire can get better speech therapy there, because she has a stutter. Um, the last thing Claire wants is more speech therapy. So she does not want to move. She wants to stay on the farm. And in the past, her mom has sort of won the argument for her.
Mhm.
And so they've stayed on the farm. But then Claire's mom passes in a car accident. And that's where this scene picks up, is right after the car accident.
Excellent, excellent. And just so our readers know, you in your day job, when you're not writing, are a speech pathologist, correct?
Mhm.
So,
Yes.
how did being a speech pathologist influence the Claire character?
Um, in a lot of ways, I think I was very intentional about when I showed Claire stuttering and what specific sounds she
Mhm.
stuttered on, because I wanted that to be accurate. And I was very, in the full book, I actually do show some scenes of her in speech therapy.
Mm,
And I was intentional that the methods that the speech therapist was using are actual real methods. And it was kind of fun. I had a couple people who stutter and another speech pathologist read the full manuscript, and they actually had some comments about how the speech therapist wasn't including enough of the emotional aspect of stuttering in her therapy. And while the speech therapist is also the volleyball coach, and she's kind of a pretty hard, tough love kind of a coach. And that was fun feedback for me because I got to think of like, okay, well, how would this coach handle that situation?
Mhm.
And it would be very uncomfortable for her. And so it was fun for me to make the coach uncomfortable and for Claire to see that her coach was uncomfortable with this and like see that okay, my coach is doing something that makes her uncomfortable, that makes me feel better doing something that I feel uncomfortable about. So that was kind of fun, and that was partially thinking of my own experience. I'm not 100% confident in all areas of my practice, and some of the clients that come across my desk, we have to just figure out and learn how I can best help them, even if I'm not totally comfortable with it. So that was fun to sort of write that into the book.
Well, that's exciting that you're able to use your real life work and your real life experiences to create a fictional story. I think as a reader, I think that really comes across when the author is very passionate about what they're writing. I think it makes the story feel just that much more realistic. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing all that. I'd like to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen for those who are watching on YouTube. For those who are listening, we will go ahead and talk through what we're seeing on the screen to the best of our ability. Okay, so in the scene that you've given me, it picks up literally directly after the car crash where we find that that Claire's mother has passed away in the accident, and this argument that's been happening over and over through the beginning of the story about where are Claire and her father going to live kind of rears its head again. Quick question. Do we see this argument in previous scenes between Claire's mother and father?
Yes.
Okay, so this is like a reoccurring scene for us. Great.
Mm-hmm.
So when I read your piece, I tend to, when I'm doing editing, especially for a new client, a writer who is new to working with me, not necessarily a new writer, because you have a book published, so you're not really a new writer. I like to read as if I were a reader. So I take my editor hat off and I just read the story because I want to see kind of where I'm naturally drawn to the characters, where I'm naturally drawn to the story. And then after my first read, I go back and I kind of put my editor hat on and I start looking for the places where the author wants to make improvements or has opportunities to change things a little bit. So in my second read, I went back and I used my favorite technique of color coding. Anyone who's ever heard me speak knows I love colors, and each color kind of means something. So in this first line, we've got the fact that Claire is waking up, or excuse me, she's not waking up. She's just curled up on the couch and her family is bickering around her. So that immediately tells me there's going to be some stormy scenes happening here. So to me, that's gray. So I highlighted that in gray. And then we're hearing Claire's father and grandfather yell back and forth at each other about where they're going to live and who's taking responsibility for Claire's mother. But we don't see Claire involved in the story because Claire is having a moment of reliving the trauma of the accident. So we're hearing this father, grandfather, and then we're seeing a flash of the scene where right after the accident. And then there's more arguing, and then there's more of the scene, and then there's more arguing and more of the scene, and more arguing and more of the scene. And then the father says, she was my wife. The grandfather says, she was my daughter. And then this is the first place we hear Claire say, she was my mom. So Claire is now coming into the scene. So I've highlighted to help us kind of see where Claire is being incorporated into the scene. I've highlighted all of Claire's dialogue in blue. Now, we have to remember that dialogue isn't necessarily words people are saying, it's their impact on the scene or the emotional exchange. So in this case, Claire is trying to communicate this, but doesn't say it out loud, whether it's because she doesn't feel comfortable saying it out loud, she's afraid she's going to stutter, doesn't actually matter, but we know this is her entering the scene. But immediately after she enters the scene with this heart-wrenching, she was my mom, like she was more than just your wife and your daughter, she was my mom. She then leaves this conversation and she goes into the kitchen where her grandmother is doing this huge amount of baking. Her grandmother's muttering to herself, so that implies some confusion or some strain. So I made that orange because for some reason confusion is orange in my head. So we hear the grandmother kind of muttering to herself. We see the kitchen full of baked goods. Everything, like every surface is covered with food and casseroles. And I really appreciated this growing up in a home where food was like the catch-all solving problem. You have heartache, there's food. You have pain, there's food. You're celebrating something, there's food. So I really like connected with the story in this moment. And then there's a moment where Claire kind of sees her mother and her grandmother working together and like having this fun little moment. And then the grandmother gets frustrated because she can't find the cinnamon. And then Claire helps her but doesn't say anything. And then when Claire's grandmother forces a cookie on her, we see Claire come into the scene again. I don't want food, Grandma, right? And then again, almost immediately, oh, I forgot to highlight that thanks, where she actually does speak here. Once we have that connection with Claire, Claire again leaves the room. When she leaves the room, she goes out for a jog and immediately she starts connecting with the world. And this is the scene where we first get to see Claire kind of in her comfort zone. And I made this one yellow because there's a little bit of hope in this scene. There's a little bit of life in this scene that we haven't seen before. And this is actually, if you are looking at just the colors, we're actually seeing Claire kind of for the first time coming out. You know, she's kind of grumbling at the grasshoppers, and then she's kind of feeling sorry for herself a little bit, which is totally understandable, right? Like that's what we want to see. And then we're starting to see the grief, and then she has a moment with her favorite cow, and there's some life in this, and she's playing with the cow, which I found very interesting because I didn't really know that cows played. So this was a fun moment for me to kind of see, you know, Claire from a different light. You know, despite the fact that she's grieving and she's got all this loss, this shows us really how comfortable she is in her own home with the friends that she has around her. Not all of them are two-legged friends. Some of them are four-legged friends, which I think is really great. And then we get to a scene where Claire returns to the house and she overhears her father weeping in his room. And I made this one blue because sadness is blue. You know, it just is. So she stands at the door and she listens for quite a while. And then right there at the very end, she tells us out loud, not loud enough for her father to hear, but out loud, that she doesn't want to move. So, you know, now we're finally seeing in the story what Claire actually wants. We've heard what other people want for her multiple times, but this is the first time we're actually hearing what she wants. Then she goes and she cries in the shower, which so many of us have done. It was really like a great way to connect. And then we kind of get into the last part of the scene, which has two parts. She wakes up to the same old argument. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? We hear the argument of everyone around her. Then we hear her say to herself, everyone knows what's best for me. And then again, the arguments around her, and we don't see her again for another couple of exchanges. once she kind of gets out the fact that she's not hungry, which is not the thing that she wants to say. What she wants to say is, I don't want to move. I'm tired of you all fighting. I miss my mother. But all she can get out of her mouth is, I'm not hungry. She again leaves. And then she has a moment with her mother where she is in, again, a safe space. We're actually getting to see her. We're getting to see her understanding of what's happening with her family and talking openly to her mother. What I really like about this scene is it mirrors the scene with Beth the cow earlier, where the words are kind of flowing freely from Claire. When she doesn't have the pressure of everything else around her, she's able to get out what she needs. She has this conversation with her mother, and her mother is helping her understand that maybe this is the right thing. She shares that she's scared, and then she goes into, I'm sorry, I'd forgotten this. I had it. This is a different beat. Then she goes and she talks to her father. And I color coded this one as green because it's kind of preparing for what happens next. She has this moment with her dad where she says to him, you know, I'll go. She doesn't say all the things that have building up before. I don't want to. I don't think it's the right thing. I want to stay here. I want to stay with my mom. I want to stay with my cows. I want to keep doing what I'm doing. She doesn't say any of that. She just says that I'll go, which I actually think is a really honest way that kids kind of communicate. And then she asks the question about, can she still play volleyball, which is obviously very important to her. And then the rest of the scene is her planning and her talking to her things about what she wants and what she hopes her life in Minnesota is going to be. So I was really impressed with the amount of clarity that you have in your story here, right? Sometimes when people are writing a prequel, they already know where the story is going to go. So the beginning scene kind of has a lot of opportunities to like foreshadow the story. And what I really like what you did here is you didn't really focus on your future story. You just really focused on the story at hand, which I think helps us as readers really stay and connect to the story. Where I did want more is I wanted to see Claire more. I wanted to get to know who Claire was more, because if the whole point of the prequel is that I'm going to go to Minnesota with this family and I'm going to see Claire go from this person who has the world happening around them but doesn't really know how to connect with it, to this person who's stronger and has a voice and really can connect and influence with the world around her, I want to feel really connected to her here. The other thing that I'd like to see is Claire is very self-aware in your story. But this is a coming of age story. And you've identified, you told me before we turned the recording on, that Claire is about 16. 16-year-olds are amazing. They're also terrible. They have a tendency to see the world through their own lens. They have a tendency to have narratives in their head about what's happening around them that may not be based on what's actually happening in the real world, but they tend to see everything through their own eyes. And one of the things that I saw in your story is Claire really has a clear understanding of the whole world around her. That may be because you already know the outcome of the next book, which Claire would not. So one of the things I'd like to do with you today is find a couple of places in the story where we can dial back Claire's self-understanding and put forth more of that teenage, I am the center of the world, and why is no one listening to me? So, thoughts before we dig in?
No, that sounds good.
Okay, great. Which would you prefer to tackle first, voice or appearance in the scenes?
Let's do appearance in the scenes.
Okay, fantastic. So let's go right back to the first. And now that we kind of know kind of where we're going, you can kind of understand why I spent a little bit of time color coding. I like to color code because without even having to read, I can start to see where characters interact with each other. This technique works great if you have larger scenes and you're trying to keep track of multiple people in the scene. This technique works great if you have unbalanced voices, where you have a character who doesn't speak very much, like Claire, and other people who tend to be very verbose. You want to make sure you're not losing your character. So I just like to color code and highlight. When I was seeing the patterns in your story, just not even having to read what's on the page, but just looking, I would notice that there's a color that identifies that there's an emotional change in the scene. And then right at the very end of that scene, we'd get one line from Claire, and then 2 lines later, we have another emotional change in the scene. And then we have a lot of scene and then a little bit of Claire. This one's a little bit different. You get a little bit more of Claire here. Oh, nope. It happens here too. She speaks and then she leaves. So it's like she gets the parting word, but we don't actually get to see her until the end of the scene, unless it's a scene like with the jogging and Beth the cow, or with her mother, and then we really have her in the scene. These are the scenes where we start seeing her from the very beginning, that we really get to know her. So what I'd like to do is take some of these other scenes, the bickering, especially because the bickering happens multiple times in your prequel, probably also happens multiple times in your story. But these scenes and the scenes with her grandmother, right? Like she feels like she's not being seen, even with her grandmother, who's supposed to be one of the people, right? Like your grandparents are supposed to be your champions. Your parents are the ones who lay down the law, but your grandparents are going to be your champions. At least that was my experience. I hope other people had similar experiences, because my grandparents were amazing. So, but we see it again here, where like she sees her father, and we see all of the emotion of her father, but we don't see her until the very end. So I'd like to find ways to bring Claire to the surface of these stories, so we can really feel her pain and her anguish during the story, because that's where we're connecting. We're connecting with people's emotions. Now, right before you sent me your page, you had mentioned in your email about the relationship that you want your readers to have with Claire's grief. Do you mind sharing kind of what your hopes are for the reader and Claire's grief?
Yeah, I want the reader to empathize with Claire's grief without being so bogged down by it that they want to put the book down. Because I was in an earlier draft of this, I was reading through it, and I was reading through it kind of as a reader, and I was like, man, this is heavy. I don't want to read it anymore. And that's when I inputted the scene with Claire and the cow, to kind of give a little bit of a pressure valve release on it. So I'm trying to strike a balance between, wow, I'm really feeling for Claire, and yikes, this is too much. I want to put this down, you know?
Excellent, excellent. So grief is one of those things that humans are naturally drawn to, right? When we see something traumatic, the old thing about like you're driving past an accident and you've been waiting in traffic all this time, and you tell yourself you're not going to look, but then inevitably like you turn and you look, right? Because tragedy is such an important emotion that we feel, but it's actually something that I heard somewhere, I don't know where I heard it, and I haven't gone back to like validate it scientifically or see what other people have written about it, but I heard once that pain is something that the brain doesn't remember. It doesn't remember the feeling of pain. So like you can remember joy, and you can remember happiness, and you can remember excitement. And if you kind of think about those emotions, you can kind of evoke those emotions. But when you try to think about pain, your brain won't let you feel the pain. You can remember having had the pain, you can remember like the consequences of the pain, and you can remember the circumstances, but you can't actually feel the pain. And I feel like grief is kind of that same way. Like you can remember grieving for someone, but you can't always feel the grief when there's been some time and some distance. Now, not to say that grief isn't a long process and you don't feel it for a long time and it doesn't change, but like the initial grief that you feel when you lose someone you love changes over time, and it's kind of hard to go back to that. But there is something very cathartic maybe about being able to remember that grief, because it helps us feel connected and helps us remember like how important someone is to us. And that's what I want to feel when I read this story with Claire losing her mother, right? Thankfully, I have not lost my mother, but you know, the thought of losing her is very scary. So reading somebody else's story who has lost someone who's that important makes me as a reader, and other people that I know who are readers who read for that emotional experience, really crave the authenticity of what happens when you're going through the grieving process. I also love what you said about not wanting to get too bogged down in it. So there's this moment of like, we need to make sure that the emotion is authentic, because we can't remember it on our own. But if we're hearing somebody else's story, we're walking through it with somebody else, it makes us feel that again, right? And we're craving that feeling. Not that feeling specifically, but we're craving different feelings when we read. And if it happens to be a story about grief, and we know it going in, we're kind of all in. But what I love about the scene that you translate into or transfer from this grief into, like, there's this moment of joy, just reminds us that even in grief, there are moments of joy, right? Like, it's not for many, many people, for some people it is, but for many, many people, grief is a process, and we go through and we feel the pain and the hurt of it. And then there's something happens that is that relief valve for us, right? Like we run into somebody and we tell a story that reminds us of the person that we lost, which you do a really great job of in the kitchen with the grandmother. And you know, if the mom were to see all the casseroles on the counter, she'd be like, "Are you feeding the whole school?" And then the grandmother has this moment of like, not just them, but their extended relatives too, right? So you definitely have those moments of levity in the story, which I really love. But let's find a way in this first scene, instead of having Claire relive the accident during this fight, let's find a way for Claire to participate in the conversation without actually participating in the conversation. So what we want to do here is we want to see some blue from Claire, right? You also told me that you don't want to do an entire scene of what happened at the accident scene, because that's not the point of the story. But we do need to immediately after this break help the reader understand the fact that while Claire and her father were in the car with their mother, it was the mother that didn't survive. And the way that you've done that is to have Claire see moments of the car accident scene amongst this fight. What I'd like to suggest to you as a different alternative is having the argument waking Claire up from a dream. So instead of having, I'm going to just go ahead and color code these so you can see them. I'm going to go ahead and color code them as purple. So we've got, she's seeing the crash in the fibers of the carpet. There was an ear-splitting twist as we slam into the deer. Her father's groaning with his head against the airbag. The uniformed men helping her mother, but there's blood spreading everywhere. Claire's pounding against the door jamb, trying to get out of the car, screaming. And then the grandfather says something that pulls her out of her memory. So you've got these 5 moments of Claire adjacent to the fight that's around her. We want to feel the pain of the crash. We want to feel the pain of the loss, but we also want to give the readers the moment of like, everyone's arguing about her mother around her, but why doesn't she get a say? So by having her relive the crash, we're missing the opportunity for her to show that she wants to be a part of this instead of actually being a part of it. So I would suggest as an option, perhaps you take a couple of these moments, doesn't have to be all of them. It can be, she heard the sirens and she saw her father and she saw her mother's blood. And then she screams, "Mom," as she's waking up, right? Like something that's showing the pain there. She's waking up on the couch. And then the first thing her father says is, "Great, now you are yelling so much, Claire can't even sleep." Right? Something so that maybe she's napping. And the fact that she was curled up on the couch, I think maybe just made me think she was taking a nap, because maybe I always take a nap when I'm curled up on the couch. I don't know. But like, if you give it that moment, it doesn't have to be the full scene. It can just be a couple of flashes, the way that you would in a dream. We're seeing her understanding of what happened right away. And then we can get into this argument. And as we get into this argument, all the places that are purple right now can be replaced with Claire saying, "That's not what Mom wants." Or, "How come nobody's asking me what Mom would want? I knew her better than anybody else," right? And now we all know as adults that Claire probably didn't know her mother better than anyone else, because children don't ever really know their parents until they start to see them as actual people instead of just their parents, right? But we want to see Claire's desperation to be part of this. Maybe the first thing Claire thinks is, "This again? Mom would hate this. Why are we keep fighting about this?" Right? But just this idea that if we can put Claire's voice in those purple spaces, instead of her remembering the trauma that she went through, we can actually feel the desperation she's feeling, instead of being told what the crash looked like and how her mother died. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Would it be helpful? Was that example enough for you, or do you want me to make a couple of suggestions that you can go back as the author later and actually put Claire's voice in? What would be most helpful?
I think I get the idea of what
Excellent.
you're trying to say.
Yeah, excellent. And you've done it in other places, like with the grandmother, right? The grandmother's pushing her to eat. You've got this, "I don't want food, grandma," right? Like, she doesn't say it, but this is what's in her head. You can do that same thing up here. But as you're doing it, you want to make sure that Claire is talking about I and me most of the time, right? Like, "Stop it. I'm tired of hearing this." Not, "Stop it. Can't we all just get along?" Right? "Can't
Mm-hmm.
we all just get along" is a very adult way of resolving problems. "I don't want to hear this anymore" is very teenage centric. "I don't care what you all are going to do. I'm tired of it." Right? So taking that voice and just turning it back a little bit, so it's more of the teenage voice. So if you're good with how to put her in the scene, let's look at a couple of other places where we can adjust the voice just a little bit. So the first voice that you have here, "She was my mom," fantastic. It both mirrors "She was my wife and my daughter," but also is very like teenage oriented. "I don't want food, grandma," that works really well. "If you think I'm bad, you should see my family." This one is starting to get into a place where it's a little bit more thought provoking, as opposed to really like focusing on this, "My family is terrible," because it's very logic based, right? "If you think I'm bad, you should see my family." And this is happening, sorry, for those of you who can't see it on the screen, while Claire is jogging, she sees the grasshoppers leaping out of her path as if fleeing her dark mood. "If you think I'm bad, you should see my family," is what she says to the grasshoppers. It works. It's not one that immediately comes to mind as like, we can take this to a more teenage space. But this, you think I'm bad. If you change it around to, my family is even worse than me, or you're lucky it's just my stomping feet and not them screaming, right? Because going to the emotional part of what she's feeling as opposed to the thought process. Again, this one can be left. I didn't really feel that this one needed to change. It's really the next one. How am I supposed to talk to them? I can't even say my own name without stuttering. This is a very intellectual understanding of what's happening. Teenagers tend to say things instead of how am I supposed to talk to them, which is very like solution focused. Teenagers tend to be much more problem focused. They won't listen to me. Nobody wants to hear what I have to say. They don't give me a chance, right? Like, it's their fault. It's not my fault. I'm not the one who needs to fix it. They need to change, right? If they need to hear me, they need to give me space. I like this moment of, I can't even say my own name without stuttering. But again, this is taking on the problem themselves. They know that I need more time. They know that when I'm stressed, I'm going to stutter more. They need to do this for me, right? Just taking that moment that I love it because it's how adults see the problem. I want to speak. I don't have any space. How do I fix this? I don't know how to fix it because I can't talk because I have this stutter, right? But teenagers don't think like that. They pull it back to themselves and tend to blame other people. And again, this isn't all teenagers everywhere, but that teenage angst that tends to comes through from the standpoint of I, me, because I don't have as much experience as maybe an adult does who has much more life experience. So,
Okay. Yeah, I had originally, I guess in an earlier draft, I had a note before that about how previously when the family members were bickering, because her dad and her grandpa don't get along.
mm-hmm.
And previously her mom would have stepped in and kind of smoothed things over or stopped the argument or whatever. And so Claire is now seeing herself as having to take on that role and not being able to. But I see what you're saying. That makes more sense that she would be more like inwardly focused on it's they won't give me an opportunity to speak.
Yep.
They won't listen to me.
Right. Mom's not here to stop them anymore. They have to do it themselves. I can't be expected to do this. I don't have it in me, right? Like, it's all very emotion based as opposed to logic based, right? Like, this new pressure, I don't want this job. Versus, okay, now this is my job. All of a sudden, this is my job and my responsibility. We can take the same thing and put it through our teenage secret decoder ring to like pull out the forward thinking and focusing on the moment. Does that make sense? Excellent. This one, how can I live without her? This is a very common thought when we lose someone we love. Maybe this is an opportunity to turn this around to, I can't do this without her. I don't want to go on without her, as opposed to, how can I live without her? Again, just that very, very small change in the language turns it from, I understand that my whole life is changing, to right now in this moment, I can't do this without her, right? Again, that teenagers tend to not think forward. They think right now. Everything is immediate. Anything that's happening in the future is very far off in general for them, because everything is about right now, right? Like, think about when you hear teenagers talk about old people in their 20s and 30s, right? Like, that's as far out as they can think. 40 and 50 is like, those people are aliens to teenagers. So that's where this, I can't live without her, by changing it to, I can't do this, I can't live in this, I can't handle this moment, I can't handle them arguing without her, right? Kind of tie it to that moment. And it doesn't have to be every single line that changes. You may decide that you want to change the how am I supposed to talk to them line and leave the I can't live without her line. That one maybe stays and the other one changes. You can change every one of them if you want, but Claire is 16, so she's starting to move past. If she were 12, I would say you want to change more rather than fewer, but she's 16, so maybe change the longer ones, the ones that feel really intellectual, and then leave the ones that are more like, how can I live without her, which is more like a one-off. Everybody feels this during loss. That's okay. Here's another one. I know I've been neglecting you. This is a very like adult understanding of how people create relationships. Maybe to take it more to the teenage side, you say, I've missed you too. Because now it's
That's better. I
honest.
was wondering how to get that across, and that is much better.
It's it's different. I don't know that it's better. It's just different, right? It's taking that moment. I'll put it in the comments over here. I've missed you too. And here's the hard thing about writing teenagers and children. Once we reach a certain part in our life as adults, it's hard to remember what it was like to be a teenager unless you have opportunities to connect with teenagers on a regular basis. Because once your brain starts to fully form, it's like it patches over all of those like moments that you want to call your parents and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I was 15, right? Like you kind of forget, you have this distance from them. And we have a tendency to start wanting to remember how things were based off of how we want it to be, based off of what we know now. So when we get into a place like this where the animal comes up and is like, hey, I've missed you so much, where have you been? We want to say to them in how we would say, how we would connect as an adult, where, yeah, this is my fault, I haven't been around for you, versus what a teenager would say, which is like, yeah, I hurt too, I miss you too. One thing that I would suggest that you do in the scene before you get into the fun or at the end of the fun, give Claire the opportunity to mourn with Beth. Maybe she leans her head against Beth's neck and just cries a little bit, and Beth, nuzzles her or whatever. So it's not just the fun, it's the fun and the grief, because this is the first time we're really getting to see who Claire is in her element. So being able to balance the joy with the grief could really connect us to her. I say that based off of the way that the scene has unfolded so far, with Claire kind of being pulled away from the scene. If you're able to pull Claire in and have us feel her frustration and her anger about not being given space to participate or whatever it is that you want us to feel here, and then this like, I'm being babied by my grandmother because all she thinks that, okay, this cookie is going to make me feel better all of a sudden for losing my mom. Then when you get here to this scene with Beth, maybe you don't need that emotional breakdown. Maybe it can just be the joy. But if the point of this part of the scene is us really understanding that Claire is thriving here despite her stutter. She's thriving here because she has friends and she can be real with them and she can connect with them. That gives us the opportunity to see this here more than just her just playing here, but she has the opportunity to connect and kind of be real here where she can't other places. Just another option for you. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We talked about how to bring Claire into the scene. We talked about how to adjust Claire's voice to pull her more into the teenage years. Is there anything else you want to talk about or you want to look at in this scene?
Looking at the very end,
Yes.
kind of that this sort of, what I was going for is she has this sort of, she's in the herb garden. She has a sort of heart to heart with her mom, which are those lines from her mom. They're actually from a previous conversation she actually has with her
Mm-hmm.
mom. And so I just took those and put them in there. And then she makes this decision, okay, I'm going to go to Minnesota with my dad.
Mm-hmm.
Because he obviously needs out
Mm-hmm.
of this place. And then I had her go back to her room and sort of looking at her room with these new eyes of like, what am I going to take with me and what I'm going to leave behind? And sort of
Mm-hmm.
feeling that, oh my gosh, I'm leaving everything behind.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to make sure that that landed well, that sort of I'm going, and then that, oh my gosh, I'm going. And then
Mm-hmm.
this like, no, I can do this. We're going to go. Cause like at least they still play, volleyball in Minnesota and that her mom was her volleyball coach as well.
Mm-hmm.
So like that's part of the reason volleyball is so important to her and part of the reason
Mm-hmm.
she doesn't want to let it go.
Okay. I would say in order to make this last part land a little bit more, where you want to spend a little bit more time is in this conversation that Claire has with her mom. She goes from, I don't want to, okay, but I'm scared very, very quickly. So starting at the beginning here where Claire's yanking out the dandelion, I don't know how to stop them from fighting. This is another one of those places where maybe instead of I don't know how to stop them from fighting, we get, sorry, I gotta find the comments. Maybe she says, why can't I find, she doesn't say this, there it is, new comment. Maybe she says, I can't do this without you. Or maybe it's, why did you have to leave me? I can't do this without you, right? Like this, it's not so much I don't know how to do it. That's what we think that she felt. But in the moment, she's just feeling lost. I can't do this. Why did you have to go? Whatever it is. And I love this idea that she can just say this right out loud without any stutter. I thought that was really great. Then we get to this place where she's mad because they're so stubborn. Well, that has a very clear understanding of what's going on. So maybe instead of they're so stubborn, it's no one listens to what I want. You were the only one who cared. Right? They're making all the decisions. You're not here to tell them what I want. Again, they don't care how I feel. This is great, right? Like they don't care. They're not listening. Nobody wants to let me, whatever. Then we have this moment here where, he'll be fine once his roots are digging in. And then you've got her saying that his roots aren't digging in, which is great, right? It extends this conversation that they've had before. And then she goes right into, I don't want to move. That's what self-sacrifice is. Again, from a scene from before, but maybe she needs to have another couple of moments where it's like, grandpa says that I need to stay. Grandma and grandpa say that I need to stay because it's good for me. But I think it's just because they want me here because they see you and me. Or, dad wants to take me to another city, but all my friends are here. What am I supposed to do? I can't farm there, or whatever it is that she feels tied to this land. Let her have that moment to just vomit out everything that she hasn't been able to say to anybody else because she can say it to her mom, right? Beyond just they're not listening to me. And then when there's this moment of like, his roots aren't digging in. Maybe she has a moment where before she gets into self-sacrifice, maybe she has a moment where she's like, maybe he would do better in the city, but I don't want to go. But maybe it's good for him. And maybe if he's in a place where he's better, he'll connect to me better, right? Like, well, maybe if he doesn't hurt so much, then maybe I can talk to him more, or maybe he wants to listen to me, right? Like something that helps her understand that while leaving isn't something she wants to do, it has to be more than it's just self-sacrifice. She has to be able to see the benefit for her dad. Maybe he won't hurt as much. Maybe right? Because this is happening after she sees him cry, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like this understanding of like, he's so sad. You're not here. He's lost without you here, right? So maybe it's not about his roots not digging in. Maybe it's he's not holding on to he can't hold on to your roots anymore, right? Like something with this idea that he never wanted to be, and maybe she's angry about that. So instead of, I don't think his roots are digging in, maybe it's he never even tried. And now that you're gone, it's his excuse to just pick up and go, right? Maybe she's angry about that. And maybe there's something about like the calmness of her mother that's like, he came here for me. If I'm not here, what's keeping him here? You're right. Like this is his excuse to go. But maybe that's a good thing. So this conversation can have a little bit more to turn her from no, 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 no to, okay, I don't like it. I'm scared, but I can do this because it's the right thing. So then after this conversation, well, actually during the conversation with her dad, she says, I'll go, right? And immediately her response is, but can I still play volleyball? Because volleyball is really important to her. But there's no acknowledgement from her dad other than this spark of hope, right? You've been saying no for months and months and months and months, and now your mom's gone, and now all of a sudden you're making this change. Where's the dad going, are you sure? What changed your mind? Like asking 1,000 questions. Or maybe he's so shocked that she's saying that she'll go that he like tries to convince her some more, and he's like, but you're really going to like it there, and you can make new friends, and there's a new speech pathologist, and he starts listing, and she's like, stop, you're not listening. I will go with you, right? Like maybe he's something to make this scene have much more emotional weight so that when you get back to her room, she's like, even when I give him what he wants, he doesn't listen to me, right? Like, how is this going to work? And now what am I going to take with me? And then in this scene, you have her leaving Mr. Buddy. Instead of her having this conversation with herself, have her have this conversation with Mr. Buddy. Okay, Mr. Buddy, we're going to pack now. What are we going to take with us? We don't need the jeans because there's no barn in the Twin Cities. We don't need the basket, or we don't need the hat because we're not going to be pilfering eggs, right? Like have her have this as a conversation, because again, instead of it being her telling herself what's happening, she's having a conversation, because that conversation really allows us to get to know her. And then the last moment can be, all right, Mr. Buddy, you stay here to look after grandma and grandpa because they're not going to know what hit them, right? Like I can close this chapter and move forward, even though it's going to be a huge change for me. So my recommendation is just lean into the dialogue a little bit more. And Claire, you obviously have lots of things that she wants to say, but instead of it being a one-sided conversation, if she's talking to Mr. Buddy, it gives us this opportunity to see that she is making connections, even though she's not connecting with people. She's connecting with cows. She's connecting with a stuffed animal. When she tries to have a conversation with her dad's talking past her. She can have a conversation with her mom because that's what she did when her mom was alive. So she can do it now. It just kind of pulls us into that emotion just a little bit more and takes what you've got here and just elevates it one level further, because what you really want to end on here is a mix of hope and pain, right? Leaving the old behind, but there's still some good stuff to come. What do you think?
That sounds good. That's good.
Okay. What else do you need from me?
Hang on. I did write down a list of questions to make sure I remember
Okay,
to ask them.
great.
I just have to find it. Pull it up.
Well, while you're looking, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story with me. I'm very invested in Claire and her family now. So,
well, that's good.
And that's what you want, right?
Oh,
Like when
yes.
people read your prequel, you want them thinking about, okay, I want to go with Claire. I want to see the Twin Cities with her.
Okay, yeah. One question I did have, it doesn't come up, I guess, too much in this prequel, but when you're writing from a teenager or a child's perspective, referring to the parents as Claire's father, her dad, over and over again, do you ever use their first names?
So I think it depends on kind of what you're trying to get across in the story. What I really appreciated in this beginning scene was that Grandpa Elliot and the father were referring to the mother as Emily, because that's how they know her, right? I thought that was really great. I think when Claire is referring to her parents, she's always going to refer to them as mom and dad. Her friends are always going to refer to them as your mom and dad. Even the volleyball coach is probably, when she's talking to Claire, is going to refer to her father as your father. And I think that's kind of realistic in, when we're talking about our parents, we tend to not refer to our parents by their first names. And when people talk to us about our parents, they refer to them as, my father or your father, or that sort of thing. I do think that sometimes you can interchange my father with dad or whatever she calls him. I think that happens a lot in conversation. Like I'll be talking to my spouse and I'll be like, yeah, I talked to mom and dad today. I don't say I talked to my mom and my dad today. I just say I talked to mom and dad today. So I think you can do that a little bit. I do think that, like, as a writer, we tend to focus on details like that really a lot because we want to get it right. But I think as a reader, we really kind of just skim over that as the same way we would use somebody's name in a sentence if we were referencing them. So I think you're okay with it.
Okay. My other question was about repetition. So there's kind of three times in the story where I kind of repeat things. So there's I think the first time is when she sees her dad and she says, this is not the man who is fighting. This is not the strict man who makes me practice parallel parking. This is not the. And then there's another one, I think, when she's talking to when she's thinking about her mom, she's saying, like, no more looking for her mom's smile at the coach's bench, no more of this. So that kind of repetition.
Yep.
Is that effective, or should I try to reword those so that they're not starting with no more, no more, no more over and over again?
Yeah. So I liked and appreciated them. I think that you might want to consider putting them in italics because they're Claire's thoughts. And it's the first one about her dad made a lot of sense to me, because I knew she was talking about her dad, right? Where was it? Well, I think it's when he's in the Yes.
That one.
This isn't the angry man, right? Like this is her understanding of what's happening in the moment. This one about her mom was a little bit more confusing to me because of where it happened in the story. She's not thinking about her losing her mom right here. The conversation above it was about, why does everybody seem to know what's best for me, but nobody's listening to me, right? Like, why does nobody, and I'm going to just give you a quick alternative for this one. Why doesn't anyone just ask me what's best for me? As opposed to, why does everyone but me seem to know what's best for me? Just again, that secret decoder ring thing. And then they're fighting about volleyball being Emily's thing. And then all of a sudden there's this moment of no more approving smiles from the coach's bench. I wasn't sure if it was related to Grandma Charlotte or the loss of her mom. So you can leave it here, but Claire felt the stabbing loss in her own chest. Just something to just do what I want you to do. They changed word and I just can't use it anymore. I've reached that age where change in technology is like, kids, get off my lawn. Okay, so if we add this stabbing loss in my chest, I think it makes it a little bit easier for me to understand that this is about her mom and not about her grandmother. But I think this imagery that you're using for her to understand the difference between her life before and her life now, I think is very impactful. I don't think that you need to take it out if you don't, especially if you like it. If you as the writer feel like it's too much, then I think you can remove it. But as a reader, I didn't feel like I needed to skip it or anything. It was just this one, like, who is she talking about here? So.
Okay.
Yep.
I tend to be an overwriter. Is there anything you think I should cut out of this?
No, actually, if anything, I would say spend more time in your conversations, because that's what, as a reader, I'm showing up for, because that's where I really get to know who your characters are. And while it's a short story and while it's a prequel, giving us that little bit more understanding of who the characters are by letting them sit in their decisions a little bit more, especially because the mom was the one who facilitated conversations, right? Like the dad and the grandfather would argue and the mother would come in and make peace. The grandmother was used to like taking care of everybody, and the mom would be like, okay, Claire doesn't need another cookie. Claire just needs to go do her homework or whatever, right? Like the mom was the one who, and maybe even facilitated communication between Claire and her dad, right? Like they're fighting about what's best for her and about speech therapy. And her mom's like, she's a kid, just let her be a kid, whatever happened before. Giving them those moments of, we don't make decisions fast, especially not in grief, which is why I really liked the fact that they kept having the same conversations over and over again, where it's like, this is never going to get resolved because nobody's moving, but nobody's listening to each other. And obviously from a teenage perspective, that's enough already. Just stop talking about this. We're either going to do it or we're not going to do it, but just stop talking about it, right? Because again, that adults can see the benefit in rehashing a conversation over and over because it gets us a little bit closer to a decision. Teenagers are just like, oh, enough. I don't care anymore, right? So for Claire to make a decision really quickly when talking to her mom, or to move past the conversation with her dad about, yeah, let's do this. What's it going to look like? To have that go really fast makes me as a reader feel like, but I want to know, like, how are they planning to do this? What's happening, right? Like, I just want a little bit more of that, which again helps me. It's great that I want that, because even in this 2,000 words, I was able to be engaged in the story enough to want to know more about that. So I would say that lean in more to your conversations, because while they add a lot of bulk, they don't add a lot of words. So you might add 2 or 3 more pages, but you're probably only going to add another, I don't know, 600 or 700 words.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was very helpful.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off, if I remember how, because I always forget.